There is a particular quality to the air in a VA Medical Center parking lot at 8:45 in the morning. It carries diesel from the shuttle buses that idle at the far end of the lot, and underneath that, something older. The smell of asphalt baking even in spring, of painted lines, fading and being repainted season after season, of a place that has been receiving people for a very long time and expects to receive more of them tomorrow and the day after that, and every day, for as long as the building stands. The Harlow County 5, a medical center, had been on that hill since 1961. In 64 years, its parking lot had seen men come back from Korea, seen women who drove themselves to chemotherapy and then drove themselves home, seen wheelchairs and walkers and white canes and the slow, careful gait of people whose bodies had given things to their country that their country did not always remember to thank them for. The lot held about 80 vehicles on this particular Tuesday morning in March, and among them a dark green Buick sedan was easing into the accessible parking space closest to the main entrance, the one with the blue hatched lines around it, the wheelchair symbol painted in the center, the one where the concrete pad meets the sidewalk at a smooth angle so that a person in a wheelchair does not have to fight gravity to reach the door. The morning light came in at a low angle from the east, catching the chrome railing of the accessible entrance ramp and turning it briefly gold. The air smelled of the parking lot's particular combination of oil and wet concrete, and the early blooming shrubs someone had planted along the building's south wall a decade ago, when a facilities manager had decided that a medical center should have something living at its edges. Somewhere in those shrubs, a bird was making a high, persistent sound. It was the kind of morning that would become warm later, but at this hour it was still cool enough that the breath of anyone standing outside was faintly visible. Marcus Greer pulled the Buick into the accessible space and cut the engine. He was 46 years old, broad through the shoulders with his father's jaw and his mother's patience, which was the better combination for a morning like this one. He had been driving his father to this facility for quarterly appointments for 4 years, since Elbert had asked him to take over after Marcus's mother Pearl died, and the logistics of coming alone had become more trouble than they were worth. Marcus had never treated it as a duty. He rearranged his work schedule around it without commentary. He brought coffee in a thermos because his father drank coffee at 8 in the morning, and he saw no reason his father should go without it just because they were driving somewhere. This was Marcus. He got out of the driver's side and came around to the rear passenger door where the collapsible ramp they kept in the back seat could extend down to the pavement. Master Sergeant Elbert Solomon Greer, United States Army, retired, sat in the passenger seat and waited. He was 72 years old. His hair had been white since he was 64, a clean and even white that he kept cropped close to the head, and his face was the kind of face that accumulates its history without apology. The lines around his eyes were deep-earned in the double exposure of desert sun and jungle shadow across 2 very different wars on opposite sides of the world. And his expression, at rest, carried a quality that some people read as sternness and others more accurately read as the look of a man who has long since stopped performing calm and simply is it. He wore a navy blue zip-front jacket over a checked shirt, dark slacks, and the same kind of low dress shoes he had worn for 4 decades because they were easy to put on from a seated position, and he had no patience for unnecessary difficulty in small things. He transferred from the seat to the wheelchair with the economy of a man who had been doing it for 34 years. There was no wasted motion, no pause for adjustment, no moment of visible effort. He placed his hands, gripped the push handles of the chair, shifted his weight with the particular forward lean he had learned in the rehabilitation center in Fort Sam Houston in the winter of 1992, and he was seated. The wheelchair was dark green, not the color that manufacturers called hunter green or forest green, but a specific deeper shade that Elbert had chosen himself at the custom chair fitting because it was close to the Army dress green he had known from the age of 18 to the age of 46, close enough that on certain days, in certain light, it was almost the same color. The chair was custom-framed, narrow enough for doorways that did not always accommodate standard chairs. With reinforced axles that Elbert had specified because he had learned early that standard axles did not hold up to the kind of use he gave them, and he was not interested in being surprised by equipment failure in places that mattered. On the left push handle, near where a caregiver's hands would naturally go, there was a small decal. An Army crest about the size of a quarter, slightly worn at one edge from years of contact with gloves and hands, and the back of the hand brushes that happen when a person moves through the world in close quarters with other people. His son Marcus had put it there in the spring of 2015, just adhered it one Saturday morning without ceremony, having ordered it sometime in the preceding weeks, and said nothing about it. Elbert had come out of the house that Saturday, and Marcus had been standing beside the chair in the driveway with the decal in his hand, and Marcus had said, "Dad, do you mind?" And Elbert had said, "What is it?" And Marcus had said, "It's an Army crest." And Elbert had looked at it for a moment and said, "All right then." Marcus had pressed it on, carefully smoothing the edges with his thumb, and stepped back to look at it, and Elbert had looked at it too. Neither of them had said anything else about it that day. But Elbert remembered the expression on Marcus's face as he smoothed those edges. The expression of a man who is handling something carefully because the thing inside it is breakable. And what was inside it was not the decal, but everything the chair represented, which was the injury, and the years and the life that had been built around the injury, and inside the years a life that was full and complete and real, and had cost what it had cost. He called the chair the second chair. The first had been issued to him at the rehabilitation center after the injury, a Humvee accident in Saudi Arabia in January of 1991, 6 days before the ground war began. The road had been mapped incorrectly, or the map had been read incorrectly in the dark, or both. The vehicle went off an embankment. The soldiers in the back were thrown clear in one direction and bruised and shaken. Elbert in the front passenger seat took the impact differently. His spine absorbed a compression at the thoracic level that the surgeons at the field hospital described in the language of field hospitals as severe, with implications for future mobility that were assessed as significant. The implications were that he would use a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He had been 46 years old at the time. He had had 2 tours in Vietnam and was on his 3rd overseas assignment. He had been a master sergeant for 4 years. He had planned to stay in the Army another 3 or 4 years and then figure out what came after. What came after arrived ahead of schedule, and it arrived in a wheelchair, and Elbert had given it exactly the period of adjustment that he deemed reasonable, and then decided it was the chair from which he would continue to do the things that mattered to him, because the things that mattered to him were not contingent on standing up. The first chair had been with him from Fort Sam Houston, back to civilian life in Harlow County, through Marcus, growing up, through the death of Pearl in 2009, through the diagnosis of Pearl's lupus, and the years of managing that together before the end, through the early work on the Veterans Advisory Board, before he was asked to chair it. By 2004, the first chair had been rebuilt twice, and stripped down twice, and rebuilt again, and was beyond the point of further rebuilding. The second chair had been with him since then. In 22 years, it had been through 9 countries. There was a service trip to the Philippines in 2008. There were 2 board conferences in Washington in 2019 and 2022. There was the pilgrimage to Vietnam in 2016, a trip Elbert and Marcus had planned for 2 years and then taken in September. Moving through Hanoi and the Central Highlands and the Mekong and certain roads that Elbert knew in a way he could not have described to anyone who had not been on them, and Marcus had stayed close and said little and held what he witnessed without putting it down, which was the right thing to do. In Hanoi, the chair had caught on a cobblestone street near the old quarter, and Elbert had maneuvered it free, and the right armrest had gotten a scratch on it. He had never had the scratch buffed out. The scratch was part of the trip, and the trip was part of the chair, and the chair was part of him, and you do not sand down your history. This was his 31st year coming to this facility. He had first come in 1992 for intake processing after discharge, and had continued coming for the spinal pain management and the full spectrum of associated care that a compression injury at the thoracic level requires across a lifetime. He knew the building the way you know a place that has mattered to you for a long time, not fondly exactly, because it was a medical facility, and fondness was not the operative feeling, but with a kind of informed respect. He knew which ramp approach was smoother and which had a hairline lip at the join that would jar the chair. He knew that the hydraulic closer on the secondary entrance was set too fast and required a specific sideways lean to catch the door before it won. He knew that Dr. Osei-Mensah kept her appointments running on schedule, not approximately on schedule, but actually on schedule, and he appreciated this in the way he appreciated all things that worked without requiring negotiation. He also knew, and he would not have put it this way, but it was the accurate description, that he was not always seen when he arrived here. Not seen as a man with a 28-year military career, 2 tours in Vietnam, 1 in the Gulf, a Distinguished Service Medal, 2 Army Commendation Medals, and 9 years of volunteer service as chairman of the Regional Veterans Advisory Board. Sometimes he was seen as an old black man in a wheelchair, and the seeing stopped there, and what happened next depended entirely on what the person doing the seeing decided to do with the image they had assembled. Elbert had known this his whole adult life, and he had made his peace with knowing it, while specifically not making his peace with the fact of it, because the first was wisdom, and the second would have been surrender, and he did not surrender things. Marcus pushed the chair toward the entrance. The accessible ramp was about 40 feet ahead, and as they moved toward it, Elbert tilted his face into the morning sun for just a moment. A reflex he had had since Vietnam, the habit of registering warmth when it presented itself. The ramp had metal handrails on both sides and a non-skid surface that someone had applied and maintained over the years. He had used this ramp many times. He had never once thought of it as a privilege. He thought of it as a door. You come through doors. That is what doors are for. That is the entire point of a door. He did not see the officer until the officer was already walking toward them across the parking lot. The man was white, heavy-set through the upper body, wearing a gray uniform with the word security printed on the chest and arm in reflective lettering. He appeared to be in his middle 30s with a close-trimmed beard and the particular stance of a man who has formed a conclusion before he arrives at the conversation. He was carrying a small binder in one hand. He walked with purposefulness which can be confidence or its imitation, and which Elbert, who had commanded people for many years, could generally distinguish between at some distance. His name was Dale Coombs. He came to a stop about 6 feet from the front of the Buick and looked at the vehicle, at the disabled parking placard hanging from the rear-view mirror, and then at Elbert in the wheelchair, and at Marcus standing behind the chair, with his hands on the push handles. Something settled in Coombs' expression in those 3 or 4 seconds of looking, resolving a decision that had been forming became complete, and Elbert recognized the shape of it immediately. He had encountered that shape many times, in many settings. It was not quite challenge and not quite authority, but a particular combination of the two that has never in Elbert's experience led anywhere productive. Coombs said that the placard on the vehicle was not the right year. The words fell into the clean morning air, and Marcus's hands tightened slightly on the push handles, which Elbert did not see but felt through the frame of the chair, because they had been doing this long enough together that Elbert could read Marcus through the chair the way a rider reads a horse. Coombs continued. His tone was that of a man delivering unwelcome information he is not entirely sorry to be delivering. He said that Harlow County issued disabled parking placards on a 2-year renewal cycle, and that the placard currently displayed appeared to be past its renewal date, which made the current parking situation a compliance issue, and they would need to move the vehicle from the accessible space. Elbert looked at the man for a moment. He had learned in 28 years of military service and 31 years since that the first response to an absurdity was not always the most useful one. Sometimes the useful response was to allow the absurdity to sit in the air between two people and see whether the person who produced it would become aware of what it was. Coombs did not become aware. He was looking at the placard with the expression of a man who believes a binder gives him standing. Elbert said in a voice that did not rise and did not soften that the placard was valid. Marcus said, with the measured containment of a man exercising genuine effort, that the placard had been renewed 11 months ago and was current under state disability parking regulations. Coombs said he understood that, but the county cycle was separate, and the sticker showed the previous period. Elbert took a breath through his nose and released it slowly. What Coombs was claiming, a county placard renewal cycle of 2 years that somehow superseded or paralleled the state certification, was not a thing that existed. Elbert had renewed his placard at the county office himself 11 months ago with a folder of documentation that he had assembled with his usual precision. The placard was valid. More than that, more than the factual incorrectness of what Coombs was asserting, they were standing on federal property. The Harlow County FIP, a medical center, was a federal installation. Its parking lot operated under federal jurisdiction. County ordinance governing disabled parking placards had no application to access at a VA medical center. Elbert knew this the way he knew the unit command structure and the Geneva Conventions and the layout of this building because it was directly relevant to his life, and he had made it his business to know the things directly relevant to his life. He said, "This is a federal facility. County placard rules do not govern parking here." Coombs said he was going to need to radio this in. There was a pause. The shuttle bus idled at the far end of the lot. The bird in the landscaping continued its high, persistent note. The morning sun was still low enough to cast long shadows from the trees at the lot's edge, and the shadows lay across the asphalt in long, parallel lines. Elbert was thinking in that pause about a road in Saudi Arabia in the dark. He was thinking about the way institutional obstruction had followed him across his entire career. Not always dramatically, not always explicitly, but with consistency, the way certain weather follows certain coastlines. The bureaucratic wall that appears in front of a man, not because it logically applies to him, but because someone has chosen to place it there and wait to see whether he will look for a way around it or simply stop. He had stopped exactly once in his life in a field hospital in 1991, and that had not been his choice. Every other time, he had found the way through. He was not going to stop in a VA parking lot because a contracted security officer was claiming a county renewal cycle that did not exist and had no jurisdiction over the ground they were standing on. He said, "I have been coming to this facility since 1992. I have a valid parking placard and a scheduled appointment. We are going to the entrance." Marcus began to push the chair forward. Coombs moved to walk alongside them. He was talking about the placard, about the process, about procedures, about how he was following protocol, about how this would get sorted out. He did not get ahead of them. He stayed alongside in the position that communicates escort without announcing it as such, which was itself a particular kind of pressure. Elbert did not respond to the running commentary. He watched the entrance ramp approaching and thought about his appointment and about the morning sun, and about the Army crest decal on the left push handle which was visible at the bottom of his peripheral vision if he glanced left. Then Coombs said something and Elbert caught it in pieces, the way you catch a transmission through interference. The words, thing and setup and time, and from those 3 words and their surrounding tone, he assembled the complete meaning, the way you reconstruct a field report from fragments. We don't have time for the whole setup with that thing. The thing was the wheelchair. Marcus stopped pushing. He stopped completely. He did not say anything immediately. There was a moment of stillness that had a particular quality, the quality of a person who has heard something and is deciding what to do with the hearing of it. And the deciding is happening very fast, but it looks slow from the outside, because the person is being very careful. Elbert put his hands to his wheels and turned the chair so he was facing Coombs directly. He looked at him. What he felt, looking at the man, was not exactly anger, though anger was present in it. What he felt primarily was something older and colder. The recognition with the specific clarity that comes from having recognized the same thing many times in many forms of the contempt that uses the wheelchair, or the age, or the face, to decide that the person inside these things is available for contempt. He had encountered this before. He would likely encounter it again. The recognition did not diminish the feeling. It simply named it accurately. Marcus said from behind the chair very quietly, "Take your hand off the chair." Elbert turned to look at Marcus and saw that Coombs' hand was on the left push handle. He did not know when it had gotten there. He had not seen the approach of the hand because he had been looking at Coombs' face. The hand was resting on the push handle near the Army crest decal in the gesture of someone who believes physical contact with a mobility device is equivalent to stopping the device and the person in it. It was not equivalent. A hand on the push handle of a wheelchair is a hand on the person in the chair. It is contact without consent, and it is restraint without authority. And it is in the most direct and unambiguous terms, an assertion that the person doing the touching has a right to stop the person being touched. Elbert had been very clear about this for 34 years, the way a person is very clear about the things that concern the boundary between their body and the world. Coombs took his hand off the chair. Then he reached for the radio on his belt. He said with the performance of calm that people reach for when the real thing has left the building, that he had a facility access compliance issue at the main entrance and needed a second officer. The radio crackled and a voice on the other end acknowledged. Marcus came around to Elbert's side and crouched slightly so they were at the same eye level. He said low enough that Coombs might or might not catch it, "You all right?" Elbert said yes. Marcus said, "We can call the director's office from right here." Elbert said, "Let it develop." Marcus nodded and straightened and went back to his position behind the chair. The entrance ramp was 15 feet ahead. Elbert moved toward it. Coombs was already there. He had moved while Elbert and Marcus were talking, moved with the specific purpose of a man who intends to be present when you arrive somewhere. What he did when he got to the ramp's base was something that Elbert processed with the precise visual attention he had developed in places where what was directly in front of him had mattered enormously. Coombs took a bollard, one of the short yellow posts on a weighted base that facilities use to mark off restricted areas, and moved it from its position at the side of the ramp to the center of it. He set it squarely in the path of anyone who intended to use the ramp. Then he said, without meeting Elbert's eyes directly, that the ramp was under inspection this morning, and access through it was temporarily restricted. He said there was a manual door to the right that was available for use. The manual door to the right was a heavy, fire-rated door, with no automatic opener, no push plate, no accessible entry mechanism. Elbert knew this door. He had used it twice in 31 years of coming to this building, once when the ramp had been legitimately under repair, and once when he had entered through the secondary entrance and cut through the lobby. Using that door from a manual wheelchair required positioning the chair at the right angle, reaching the handle at a distance that required a significant lean, pulling the door open against its own weight and against the tension of its hydraulic closer simultaneously, and then maneuvering through the gap before the closer engaged and pushed the door back. It was not impossible. Elbert had done significantly harder things than that. He had done harder things than that before breakfast on any given day in Vietnam. But the accessible entrance ramp existed specifically so that he did not have to. It existed because at some point in the history of this building, someone had decided that people who use wheelchairs should not have to fight for entry to their own medical appointments, that the physical environment should accommodate the person, rather than requiring the person to accommodate the environment. The bollard placed across the ramp's center was not an inspection barrier. There was no inspection. The bollard was a message, and the message was, "You can go around." Elbert did not go around. He moved the chair to within 4 feet of the base of the ramp and stopped. He said with the voice that he had used in 28 years of military service when addressing people who needed to understand something completely and finally, and without any ambiguity about whether he would be repeating himself. "I have been coming to this facility since 1992. Move the bollard," he said at once. Coombs' expression shifted through several configurations in the space of a few seconds. The certainty wobbled. Something behind his eyes did the calculation that people do in these moments, the assessment of how much authority he actually had tested against the specific quality of the voice that had just told him to move the bollard. But the calculation, whatever it produced, did not move him. He said that the inspection was a facility matter, and he did not have the authority to override it. That was a lie. There was no inspection. He had the authority to move the bollard because he was the person who had placed it. Elbert looked at him steadily. He produced his VA identification card. He did this not because Coombs had formally requested it again in the past several minutes, but because Elbert understood that the record needed to be established, the record of who he was, and the fact that he was presenting himself with valid credentials at this entrance and being refused access. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and took out the leather card sleeve. It was a small thing, just large enough for the VAID and one or two additional cards made of brown leather with a simply stitched edge. His granddaughter Amara had made it in a craft class when she was 9 years old. She was 14 now. She had painted a small Army star on the front in gold paint, and the star was slightly uneven in the way that things painted by 9-year-old hands are uneven, not quite centered. The points of varying lengths, the gold paint a little thick in places. Elbert carried it because it was Amara's work, and because the imperfect star on the front told him something about who he was before anyone else in any waiting room or any parking lot or any encounter like this one got the chance to tell him something different. He opened the sleeve and extended the card. Coombs took it. He looked at the front, the photograph, the ID number, held it for a moment, and handed it back. He said in a tone that had shifted slightly, not into acknowledgement, but into the position of a man trying to relocate his argument on a new terrain, the VAID didn't change the placard situation. Those were two separate matters. Elbert took the card back and put it in the sleeve and put the sleeve in his jacket pocket. He had in that moment complete clarity about the shape of what was happening. The placard was not the point. The ramp was not the point. The inspection that did not exist was not the point. The point was the shape of the entire encounter, which was a man in a wheelchair, arriving at a door he had come through many times, and the assertion through placard, claims and bollards and hands-on push handles and references to that thing that his presence here was something that could be questioned. That entry was something he could be made to negotiate for. That the ordinary fact of arriving at a place where he had every right to be was something that could be converted into a problem he would eventually tire of and withdraw from. He was not going to withdraw. He was also not going to raise his voice because his voice was not what the situation required. What the situation required was a witness with standing, and Elbert had been coming to this building for 31 years, and he knew the building, and he had reason to believe that the building was not without people who would understand exactly what they were looking at. What happened in the minutes that followed was a particular kind of waiting, not passive, not resigned, but the deliberate holding of a position in the full knowledge that the position was correct. Elbert had learned this in the Army, not in any manual or training program, but in the lived experience of being a black man in a military hierarchy where the hierarchy was not always consistent about who it honored and who it saw. He had learned that to leave a position under pressure when the position was right was to concede something that could not be retrieved. He had learned this at 23 and at 31 and at 42, and he had practiced it for long enough that it did not feel like discipline anymore. It felt like the natural posture of a man who knows where he stands. He was also thinking in the particular way he had of thinking in parallel with whatever was happening around him, attending to the situation fully and also to the interior space where he processed things about what it meant to be here in this parking lot, at this ramp, at this age, having given what he had given. He thought about 1968 Hugh City, the Tet Offensive, mud and noise, and the specific quality of fear that becomes something else when it goes on long enough. When fear is just the baseline, and what you are managing is not the fear, but the performance of your function within it. He thought about the Gulf 1991, the briefings in the desert air before the ground war, the road that was mapped incorrectly, the dark. He thought about Fort Sam Houston and the rehabilitation center and the first months of learning the chair, not the chair itself, which was mechanical and could be learned, but what it meant to move through the world from the seated position, to read the built environment differently, to understand viscerally which doors opened and which did not, which ramps were genuine and which were gestures, which people saw the wheelchair first and stopped their seeing there, and which people looked further. He had given those things. The Army had his 20s and 30s and most of his 40s. He had given them without reservation, not because he was naive about what the institution was and how it worked and what it did to people in his position, but because the mission at its core was real, and the people around him in those years were real, and the cost of not giving was greater than the cost of giving. That was what he had decided in the particular way that a person makes decisions that shape everything downstream of them, and he did not revisit it. What he wanted in return, what he had always wanted, and had never stopped wanting, was not gratitude, which is unstable and usually insufficient. What he wanted was the ordinary terms. The ramp clear. The door open, the appointment kept the record read. The ordinary dignity of a man arriving at a place where he has an appointment and being received without interrogation about whether he belongs there. He had been asking for this his whole adult life in 100 different forms, and the asking had never felt routine because it should not have been something that needed to be asked for. He sat in the second chair 4 feet from the base of the blocked ramp, and he waited. He did not look at Coombs. He did not look at his phone, or at Marcus, or at any of the things a person looks at when they are waiting uneasily. He looked at the entrance door, at the space above the bollard, at the air, where the ramp rose to meet the building. He looked at it steadily the way he had looked at other things in his life that were in his way and that he intended to pass through. The accessible entrance door opened from the inside. It opened with the pneumatic sound of a pressurized interior meeting the spring air of the parking lot, and through it stepped Dr. Pauline Osei-Mensah. She was 58 years old, compact and direct in her movement, wearing a dark blazer over a printed blouse. Her facility ID badge on a lanyard that swung once as she stepped through the doorway. She was not carrying files or a bag or anything else. She had come through this door the way she came through most things, without preamble, with her attention already on what was in front of her. As director of the Harlow County Medical Center, she had come through this particular door hundreds of times. She had had no reason when she decided to step out for a moment this Tuesday morning to expect to walk into a scene at the base of the accessible entrance ramp. She took in what was in front of her in approximately 2 seconds. In that 2 seconds, she saw a contracted security officer standing at the base of the ramp with a bollard placed across it. She saw a man in a dark green wheelchair 4 feet from the ramp's base. She saw another man standing behind the chair. She saw the particular stillness of the man in the wheelchair, which was not the stillness of someone waiting to be helped, but the stillness of someone who is managing a situation and has been managing it for some time. And then she recognized him. She had known Elbert Solomon Greer since the spring of 2017, when she had taken over as director and reviewed the Veterans Advisory Board's composition, and reached out to ask him to chair the board. She had made that request because his military record, his decade of community service, and his understanding of the VA system made him the most qualified candidate available. She had not expected him to say yes quickly. She had prepared for a negotiation, and he had said yes in approximately 30 seconds, which told her something about him that a longer conversation might have obscured. She had sat across from him in board meetings 3 times a year since then. She knew his voice. She knew the specific quality of his attention in a meeting, the way he listened to reports, without expression, until the moment he asked a question which was always the precise question that the presenter had hoped would not be asked. She knew the dark green wheelchair. She knew the Army crest on the left push handle because she had noticed it at some point in 2018 or 19 and had registered it and moved on the way. You register the small personal artifacts that people carry and decide they are private and therefore not for comment. She stepped through the doorway and down to the ramp level. She said, "Master Sergeant Greer, I apologize for the delay." The words fell into the morning air with the specific weight of a person who means them not as social formula, but as the opening of a record. She was here, she saw what she was seeing, and she was accounting for it. Then she turned to Coombs. What she saw in Coombs' face was something she had seen before in people who had built a position on a set of assumptions, and then encountered the full weight of what those assumptions had missed. The certainty left his face in stages quickly like water moving out of something porous. His mouth opened and did not form words. His hand, which had been holding the binder with the particular firmness of a man who believes the binder is a source of authority, loosened its grip. Dr. Osei-Mensah said, "This is Master Sergeant Elbert Solomon Greer, United States Army, retired. 28 years of service. He holds the Distinguished Service Medal and 2 Army Commendation Medals. He has served as chairman of the Regional Veterans Advisory Board for 9 years. She said it the way she said things at board meetings and informal proceedings, with precision, without editorial inflection, because the facts themselves carried the weight and did not need her to carry it for them. Then she asked Coombs, "What is the nature of the access issue?" 6 seconds passed. In those 6 seconds, Marcus watched his father's shoulders ease just slightly, just enough to tell Marcus that something in his father had been held taut for the past 12 minutes and was now permitted to relax by a single degree. Marcus had been watching his father for 46 years, and he knew every degree of that scale. 1 degree was a great deal. Coombs's mouth worked. He said something about the placard. He said something about the county renewal cycle. Dr. Osei-Mensah said via parking is federal jurisdiction. County placard regulations do not apply to this facility. She looked at the bollard across the ramp. She did not say anything about the bollard for a moment. She looked at it with the expression of a person who is considering something carefully before speaking about it, which was her general approach to things that warranted careful consideration. Then she said, "Remove the bollard." Coombs bent and picked up the bollard and moved it back to the side of the ramp where it had been before he placed it in the center. He did this without speaking, with the careful movements of a man who is very aware of being watched and has no remaining position to occupy except compliance. He set the bollard down at the edge and straightened. Dr. Osei-Mensah turned to Elbert. She said, "The ramp is clear, Master Sergeant. Let's get you inside." He looked at her for a moment. In 34 years of using a wheelchair, he had been offered help in many ways. Help that was kindness, help that was performance, help that was the kind of pity that diminishes the person it is directed at, and help that was the ordinary acknowledgement between 2 people who have worked together long enough to understand what the moment requires. What Dr. Osei-Mensah was offering was the last of those. It was not theatrical. It was not excessive in its apology. It was a return to the ordinary terms, which were that he was a man who came to this building for his care and for his board service, and the ramp was clear, and the door was open, and he was expected inside. He put his hands to his wheels. Marcus moved behind the chair, and they went up the ramp together with the unhurried steadiness they had developed over 4 years of doing this, and the entrance door opened ahead of them with its pneumatic exhale, and the institutional air of the building came out to meet them, cool and antiseptic, and carrying underneath that the specific undertone of a place where people are being kept alive and treated and maintained, which is a different scent from the outside world particular to hospitals and facilities. in a way that Elbert had known for decades and that registered to him not as unpleasant but as purposeful. Behind them on the ramp, Dr. Osei-Mensah spoke to Coombs. Her voice did not carry into the lobby. The conversation was brief. Coombs did not respond audibly to anything she said. She came inside a few minutes later with the expression of a person who has addressed something that needed addressing and has moved to the next item. Gerald Torres, the facility operations manager, arrived at the entrance 8 minutes after that. He was 51, with 16 years of VA service, and he moved with the pace of a man who had received specific information and was acting on it. When he saw Dr. Osei-Mensah in the lobby, he came directly to her, and she told him in 4 sentences what the camera at the entrance canopy would show. He nodded through all 4 sentences and asked no clarifying questions. He said he would pull the footage immediately. He said he would contact the contracting company before noon. He said, "How is Master Sergeant Greer?" She said, "He's at his appointment. He is fine." Torres said, "I'll want to speak with him afterward if he's willing." She said she would ask. Torres went to his office, which looked out over the parking lot. He pulled the entrance camera footage and watched it in full. The camera was positioned under the entrance canopy and covered the accessible parking space, the sidewalk, and the full ramp approach. The footage ran from the moment Coombs walked out to the Buick to the moment Dr. Osei-Mensah cleared the ramp, and it showed everything with unambiguous clarity. The approach, the placard confrontation, the walk alongside the words about that thing and the setup, the bollard placed in the center of the ramp, the hand on the push handle, the radio call, the wait, and then Dr. Osei-Mensah stepping through the door. It showed the 6 seconds of silence after she said Elbert's name and rank and title. It showed the bollard removed and put back at the edge. It showed Elbert and Marcus going up the ramp. Torres watched it twice. He wanted to be certain he was not missing anything. He was not missing anything. He called the contracting company. Harlow Security Solutions had held the VA facility security contract for 4 years. When Torres reached the operations director, he described what the camera footage showed. The operations director was quiet for a longer pause, then felt comfortable, and then asked to see the footage. Torres said it would be provided. The director said Coombs had been on the VA assignment for 2 years and had received a positive mid-year review in 2025. Torres said he was aware of that. He said he was also aware that there were 7 prior complaints on file regarding Coombs at the VA facility. He said that 4 of those complaints involved veterans using assistive devices, wheelchairs, walkers, and a power scooter. He said that none of the 4 had been escalated to formal review within the VA's internal process, and that he was prepared to account for that failure in writing as a process breakdown on the VA's side. He said that the prior complaint history combined with the footage from this morning constituted a pattern that the VA was not able to ignore. The operations director asked what outcome the VA was seeking. Torres said, "We are seeking the permanent removal of Mr. Coombs from VA facility assignments effective today. We are seeking a contract-level review of Harlow Security Solutions' access to this and all regional VA facilities in the system. We are seeking written confirmation within 30 days that all 7 prior complaints have been formally reviewed, and that the company has implemented accountability measures for accessibility compliance." There was a pause. The operations director said they would begin the personnel action immediately. Torres said he appreciated that, and confirmed that Dr. Osei-Mensah was filing a formal incident report with the VA's Office of Inspector General, and that the contracting company should have its documentation in order for that process. He ended the call and sat at his desk and looked at the parking lot through his window. He could see the accessible space where the Buick had been. The space was empty now. He could see the entrance ramp clear the bollard back in its side position, the sun now higher, and the gold from the chrome railing gone, the railing just chrome again in the mid-morning light. He made a note in the facility action file that accessible parking signage at all entrances needed to be updated to include explicit statement of federal jurisdiction with respect to parking access, and veteran accommodations. He would have the facilities team do it within the week. He also noted that the complaint review process needed a 30-day mandatory escalation trigger for any complaint involving assistive device access, which did not currently exist in the process and needed to. He documented both items with the seriousness of a man who understood that the policy changes, small as they might appear on paper, were not small in the lives of the people who came through these doors. He thought about the 4 veterans who had filed complaints before this morning. He did not know their names. The complaints were in the file under case numbers, and he had not pulled the full records yet, but he would. He thought about each of those 4 people arriving at this facility or at another facility in the regional system and encountering the same shape of refusal. Some of them might have found a way around. Some of them might have waited. Some of them might have left. He did not know what it had cost them individually to file a formal complaint. Afterward, the paperwork. The time, the energy of putting into institutional language something that had happened to them in a parking lot or at a door, and that should not have happened at all. He knew that veterans as a population did not complain easily. The culture of the military, whatever else it was not a culture that encouraged complaint. It was a culture that valued handling your own situation and moving forward. When a veteran filed a formal complaint, it meant the thing had been significant enough to overcome that culture and the thing deserved review, and the review had not happened. He was going to make sure it happened now. All 4. He was going to read all 4 files himself before the end of the week, and he was going to document what they showed and what should have been done in each case and what the failure of the review process had allowed to continue. He was not going to delegate that. It was his to do. Elbert's quarterly appointment lasted 90 minutes. It was a review of his spinal pain management protocol, which had been in adjustment over the past 3 years as the compression injury at the thoracic level evolved in the way that these injuries do across decades. Not in a simple worsening, but in the complex dialogue between an old trauma and an aging body. The injury becoming something slightly different in the context of a body at 72 than it had been at 60 or 50 or 46 when it first happened. He spoke to his care team with the same directness he brought to everything. He answered their questions. He asked his own, which were specific and preconsidered, because he came to medical appointments the way he had come to briefings prepared, knowing what he needed, knowing what questions would clarify what he needed to know. He agreed to a minor adjustment in his medication schedule. He had been doing this for 34 years. He was neither afraid of it nor dismissive of it. He treated his care as he treated everything that required sustained attention. Over a long time, he showed up. He paid attention. He did the work. When he came out to the lobby after the appointment, Gerald Torres was there. Torres introduced himself formally, which was not strictly necessary since they had met twice at facility events, but Elbert let him do it because a man preparing to offer a genuine apology deserves a formal context. And this was what Torres was preparing. Torres described what the camera footage had shown, what calls he had made, what actions had been initiated with the contracting company, and what process changes he had logged for the facility. He told Elbert about the 7 complaints and the 4 involving assistive devices, and he said that plainly without softening it as something other than what it was. He said the review process had failed to flag the pattern. He said that he had already logged a corrective action and that a 30-day mandatory escalation trigger for assistive device access complaints would be formalized in writing before the end of the week. At the end, he said, "I'm sorry, Master Sergeant," simply and without qualification, the way that rare kind of apology sounds when it is real. Elbert listened to all of it and looked at Torres steadily throughout. He had heard many institutional apologies in his life, apologies delivered as a form of punctuation, a way of signaling the end of a conversation rather than the beginning of a change. This was not one of those. Torres was still looking at him when he said it. He did not look away when the words were out. That mattered. When Torres finished, Elbert said, "I appreciate you moving quickly on the prior complaints. Those should have triggered review before today." He paused. He said the men and women who come to this facility with assistive devices are not a separate category of patient. They are veterans. They are owed the same access as everyone else who comes through these doors. When someone uses a bollard and a false claim and a hand on a wheelchair to tell a veteran that their access is conditional, that is not a procedural issue. That is a fundamental failure. Torres said, "Yes, sir." Elbert said, "Good. Then I'll see you at the next board meeting." He had served on the Veterans Advisory Board for 9 years. In that time, he had never brought a personal incident before the board. His role was to represent the collective experience of veterans in the regional system, not to adjudicate his own. But what had happened in the parking lot and at the entrance ramp that morning was not only his experience. It was the experience of 4 other veterans who had filed complaints about the same officer involving the same class of access veterans who had filled out the forms and documented what happened to them and submitted those documents into a process that had not moved. He did not know their names. He could reconstruct from complaint numbers and dates approximately what had happened to them. He knew what a complaint about assistive device access at a VA facility meant in plain terms. He knew what it meant to file one and have it sit unreviewed. At the next Veterans Advisory Board meeting held on the second Thursday of April, Elbert addressed the board in his capacity as chairman. He had thought for 3 weeks about what he wanted to say, and he had decided that what he wanted to say was precisely what had happened in the order it had happened, without embellishment and without the tempering that public speakers sometimes apply to things that do not deserve to be tempered. He told the board about the parking placard claim and why it was incorrect. He told them about the ramp and the bollard and the false inspection. He told them about the reference to his wheelchair as that thing and the words, "We don't have time for the whole setup." He told them about the hand on the push handle and the radio call for backup. He said these things simply in order without raising his voice once. Then he told them about the 7 complaints. He told them about the 4 involving assistive devices. He told them about the absence of mandatory review. He said, "We cannot hold this VA system accountable to the veterans it serves if we do not hold ourselves accountable when the system fails to protect those veterans at the point of entry." Access to care begins in the parking lot. It begins at the ramp. It begins at the door. If we accept that these access points are where veterans who use mobility devices are made to prove themselves and fight for what everyone else receives without question, then we have failed every person who comes to this building in a wheelchair or with a walker or with a white cane or with any other accommodation that this facility is legally and morally obligated to support. He proposed a resolution. The resolution called for mandatory accessibility compliance training for all contracted security personnel at VA facilities in the region. It called for a 30-day mandatory review trigger for all complaints involving assistive device access. It called for federal jurisdiction signage at all facility access points. It called for an annual accessibility audit of all VA medical center entrances and parking areas in the regional system. He had drafted it with the same care he brought to everything that went into a formal record over 2 evenings at the desk where he had been doing this kind of work for 9 years. He presented it clearly and waited. The board voted. The resolution passed unanimously and without abstention, which was what it deserved. He folded his notes. He took a breath. He looked at the room, the 8 board members, and the 2 facility representatives and Dr. Osei-Mensah at the far end of the table, and he held what had just happened for a moment. He was not sentimental about resolutions. He had drafted and passed resolutions before, and he knew that a resolution was a record of intent and that intent was only the beginning of change. The change came in the implementation in the training actually delivered, and the complaints actually reviewed, and the signs actually installed. And those things happened over months, and were measured in small increments. and were never the kind of thing that announced itself as triumph. He knew this, and he was at peace with it. He had been doing work that moved in small increments for 9 years. He was prepared to continue, was prepared. But the resolution meant that the morning of March was in the formal record now, and the 4 prior complaints were in the formal record alongside it, and the board's unanimous vote was in the formal record. And that meant that when the next man or woman arrived at this facility in a wheelchair, or with a walker, and was told by someone in a gray security uniform that there was a problem with their access, there was a document that said the board had already considered this and already decided what the answer was. That was not everything. But it was something. It was the thing he could do, and he had done it, and now the next part would begin. After the meeting, as the room cleared and Elbert organized his papers, she came to where he was sitting and said quietly, "You handled the morning of March with more patience than most people would have had." He looked at her. He said, "Patience is not what I was practicing." She waited. He said, "I was practicing the belief that the situation would resolve correctly if I did not remove my presence from it. That is not patience. That is a different thing." She considered that for a moment. She said, "I'll take that distinction." He said, "Good." Marcus was in the lobby when Elbert came out of the elevator, and they went together through the main lobby and out through the accessible entrance down the ramp into the afternoon. The parking lot smelled now of warm asphalt and the faint exhaust of a shuttle that had pulled away recently. The sun was on the west face of the building, and the shadows of the trees at the lot's edge reached almost to the accessible space where the Buick was parked. It was a different light than the morning had been warmer, lower, the kind of afternoon light that makes everything a little more golden and a little more tired-looking at the same time. Marcus had the car pulled around and opened the passenger door. Elbert transferred from the chair to the seat with the familiar economy of motion that had not changed in 34 years, the same lean, the same grip, the same completion. Marcus folded the chair, put it in the back seat, and came around to the driver's side. He started the engine but did not pull out. He said, "You all right?" Elbert said yes. Marcus said, "I kept going back to the hand on the chair." Elbert said, "I know." Marcus said, "I wanted to do more than say what I said." Elbert looked at him. He said, "You said exactly what needed saying. You said it once." That was right. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does it get easier?" "Any of it." Elbert looked out through the windshield at the entrance ramp. The ramp was clear. The bollard was at the side where it belonged. The signage on the building was the same signage it had always been, though new signage would be added within the week, Torres had told him, and it would say what it should have said all along. Federal jurisdiction, accessible parking valid under federal law, county ordinance does not apply. He said, "It does not get easier. It gets more familiar, which is not the same thing." He paused. He said, "What changes is what you do with the familiarity. You let it inform you, or you let it exhaust you. Those are the 2 options." Marcus said, "Which do you choose?" Elbert said, "I try to choose the first. I don't always succeed." Marcus nodded. He put the car in reverse. As they backed out of the space, Elbert could see the left push handle of the wheelchair through the gap in the back seat. The Army crest decal was there, worn slightly at one edge, the color still true. He looked at it for a moment. He thought about the Saturday in April of 2015 when Marcus had placed it there with his careful hands, smoothing the edge with his thumb, stepping back to look at it. He thought about Marcus's face that day, the face of a man holding something he could not put into words because the words were too small for it. Something about his father and the years and the chair and the cost of things, and the fact that the cost, whatever it had been, had not broken anything that mattered. He thought about Amara painting the Army star on a piece of brown leather at 9 years old with the concentration and the slightly unsteady hand of a 9-year-old doing careful work, and how she had given it to him at a Sunday dinner and said, "Pop, Pop, I made you a thing for your card," and he had taken it and opened it and looked at the imperfect star and said, "It's perfect," which was both a grandfather's answer and, he believed, the accurate one. He thought about the 4 veterans before him, the ones he did not know by name, the ones who had filed their complaints and waited and received no formal review. He thought about each of them at a ramp or a door, managing the same shape of encounter, navigating the same assertion that their access was something to be questioned. He thought the resolution does not undo those 4 mornings. It does not give those 4 people back what they spent managing, what should not have required managing. It is not enough. But it is what can be done with what is immediately in front of us, and doing the thing that can be done is not nothing. It is often the only honest answer to something that should not have happened. The Buick moved out of the Harlow County Fava Medical Center parking lot and onto the main road. The building receded in the passenger mirror. The afternoon had gone warm finally the way the morning had promised it would, and the light on the road was the low gold of a Tuesday that was almost done. Elbert Solomon Greer had been coming to this facility since 1992. He would come back in 3 months. The ramp would be clear. He would go through the door the same way he had always gone through it, because that is what doors are for. That is the entire and sufficient point of a door. If this story held something for you, share it with someone who should hear it, and subscribe our channel where every week we bring you the stories of people who hold their ground.